Chapter 5. Enlightened Family Planning. How many kids do you want when you're 60? Nothing I've ever done has given me more joys and rewards than being a father to my children. Bill Cosby. In 1992, Gary Becker won the Nobel Prize in Economics for one big idea. Economics is everywhere. He saw economics in discrimination. Employers hire people they hate if the wage is right. He saw economics in crime. Crooks rob banks because that's where the money is. He saw economics in education. Students endure years of boring lectures because they're fascinated by higher pay after graduation. Perhaps most important, Becker saw economics in the family. Human beings plan their families on the basis of enlightened self-interest. Parents look at the world, form roughly accurate beliefs about the costs and benefits of kids, and make babies until they foresee that another would be more trouble than he's worth. I'm a devotee of Gary Becker. Once, when I was visiting the faculty club at the University of Chicago, he unexpectedly sat down for lunch. I barely stopped myself from blurting out, "Oh my God, you're Gary Becker!" Still, my idol doesn't always get things right. One pillar of his family economics is the assumption that the fewer kids you have, the better they'll be. Becker matter-of-factly speaks of the quality-quantity trade-off. A central lesson of behavioral genetics, as we've seen, is that the trade-off is often illusory. Parents who believe otherwise base their family plans on misinformation. Is this merely one admittedly large oversight on Becker's part? Or has the ability of enlightened self-interest to explain the family been oversold? Can enlightened self-interest explain the shrinking family? Be nice to your kids, they'll choose your nursing home. Popular bumper sticker. The greatest perceived triumph of the economics of the family is its explanation for the global fertility decline. In the second half of the 50s, American women had a total fertility rate of almost 4 children. 50 years later, it was 2.1. We see similar patterns over most of the globe. During the same period, France went from a total fertility rate of 2.7 to 1.9 kids, Germany from 2.3 to 1.3, Japan from 2.2 to 1.3, Mexico from 6.8 to 2.2, and China from 5.5 to 1.8. Becker and the many economists who extended his work are confident that enlightened self-interest explains the worldwide downsizing of the family. Their position is appealing. When I see a change of this magnitude, I too presume that self-interest is the cause. A few people sterilize themselves to save the planet, but most of us are too selfish to make big sacrifices for what we see, rightly or wrongly, as the common good. Do you feel like giving up your car to fight global warming? Still, a presumption is not an explanation. Why specifically would it be in our self-interest to have fewer kids than before? The answer people often spit out is that big families are no longer affordable. But the opposite is true. Big families are more affordable than ever because we're more than 3 times richer than we were in 1950. You can see our mounting riches in our homes. Compared to the tiny dwellings of the 50s, modern families live in castles with air conditioning. Why hasn't the size of our families grown in step with the size of our houses? Becker knows how rich we've grown, so he tells a subtler story about why self-interest implies fewer children. He promisingly begins by focusing on the people who do most of the child care. Moms. The women of 2010 give up more to have a child than the women of 1950. Back when women's wages were low, staying home for a few years to raise another kid was a small financial sacrifice. Women earned so little that they didn't have much to lose. Now that working women make good money, staying home for a few years to raise kids can stop mom from earning hundreds of thousands of dollars. This explanation sounds good, but it's not as smart as it seems. Women lose more income when they take time off, but they also have a lot more income to lose. They could have worked less, earned more, and had more kids. Since men's wages rose too, staying home with the kids is actually more affordable for married moms than ever. If that's too retro, women could have responded to rising wages by working more, having more kids, and using their extra riches to hire extra help. A variant on the rising women's wages story claims that family size shrank because women's bargaining power increased. Since women pay most of the cost of bearing and raising children, it was supposedly in their self-interest to use their newfound leverage to negotiate for fewer kids. But this story falsely assumes that women want smaller families than men do. When the World Values Survey queried men and women around the world about ideal family size, the sexes saw almost eye to eye. In the United States, the average woman wanted 0.1 children more than the average man. Why would women use their new bargaining power to demand changes that they don't desire? Another selfish explanation for lower birth rates points to birth control. We always wanted sex without children, and now we can finally live the dream. A tempting tale, but it's not as sexy as it looks. Condoms have been widely available since World War II, when the U.S. military started issuing them to soldiers. Families in the 50s had the technology to keep their families small. Returning veterans and their wives opted for a baby boom instead. Perhaps the most popular selfish explanation for smaller families, though, claims that people used to have children to support them in their old age. Now that the government provides for retirees, children are obsolete investments. But this story's key assumption is wrong. Money primarily flows from old to young. It's long been true and remains true today. Anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer societies have found children consumed more food than they caught at all ages until age 18. Grandparents continued to work hard to support their grandchildren and produced more than they ate. At almost no time in their adult lives did adults produce less than they consumed. The same goes for traditional farmers. Investing in your children is less lucrative than stuffing money in your mattress. In modern societies, little has changed. Parents give more to their children than they can hope to recover. Take the United States in the 1980s. One research team using the Survey of Consumer Finances found that parents gave their kids large cash gifts, $3,000 plus, much more often than the reverse. Another researcher using the Consumer Expenditure Survey found that, ignoring child rearing and college costs, parents on average voluntarily gave a total of $25,000 more to each child than they got back. The lesson: an economic perspective on fertility is not useless, but it is much less intellectually satisfying than advertised. For an extra helping of disillusion, note that the decline of family size has not been smooth. In the middle of the century, the United States had the legendary baby boom. The total fertility rate soared from a little more than 2 kids in the early 30s to a little less than 4 kids in the late 50s. America's total fertility rate bottomed out in the mid-70s at 1.7 kids. At the time, women earned 60% as much as men, and only 45% worked. Now they earn 80% as much as men, and 60% work. If women's foregone earnings and career options were decisive, children would now be rarer than ever. Instead, American fertility rebounded back to replacement. The triumph of hindsight bias. There is no shortage of popular explanations to account for the drop in fertility. In Athens, it's common to blame the city's infamous air pollution. Several years ago, a radio commercial promoted air conditioners as a way to bring back Greek lust and Greek babies. Russell Shorto, no babies. Human beings tend to rationalize the past as inevitable. Psychologists call this hindsight bias. Case in point, since we know that family size has fallen, we instinctively treat this decline as the only possible outcome. Every major social change seems like yet another reason for parents to want fewer kids than they used to. What happens if we strive to overcome hindsight bias? Let's pretend we don't know how the story turned out, then mentally review the last 50 years. On reflection, modern parents have serious, self-interested reasons to want bigger families than ever. Technology vastly improved. Think how much work a child was back when moms had to launder diapers by hand and cook every meal from scratch. Parents shopped in a dozen different stores to feed and dress their families. It's remarkable that our great-grandparents chose to have any children at all. Compare that to the modern world of disposable diapers, washer-dryers, microwaves, dishwashers, Walmart, and Amazon. I can see progress between 2002 and 2010. My third son's kiddopotamus swaddling blankets are far superior to his brother's old-fashioned rectangular wraps. Raising kids is not yet easy, but it's way easier than it used to be. We're much richer. Our real incomes more than tripled since the 1950s. Back in the bad old days, parents might literally worry about having another mouth to feed. Now most of us have the resources to feed, clothe, and shelter the Brady Bunch. Today's parents have money to throw at problems great and small. Need a night out or help around the house. There's much more to spare for babysitters, nannies, and house cleaners. Too tired to cook? Restaurant budgets are much bigger than they were in the bad old days. Need a little peace and quiet? You're more likely to find them in a McMansion than a duplex. Financial benefits are probably no worse than before. A stubborn believer in the kids as pensions theory might admit that kids were never a good investment, but insist that they're now deeper money pits than ever. They are probably wrong. In the old days, elders died too young to receive much of their pension. When Social Security began, 30-year-olds could expect to survive to age 68. Today, the average 30-year-old makes it to about 80. So even if parents get a lower level of annual support from their children than they used to, they collect for many more years. Non-financial benefits are longer lasting and better than ever. Thanks to rising lifespans, modern parents enjoy their children's non-financial assistance for many more years. Your kids rarely buy you a palace in your old age or even pay your bills, but they usually include you in their lives and help with emergencies great and small. When trust is an issue, kids are a better bet than hired help, and the more bets you place, the better your odds. One careful study of elder care found that each additional child substantially cut the chance of ending up in a nursing home. Back when people died at 60, this flow of services didn't last long. Now you can expect to collect for decades. Furthermore, in our rapidly advancing world, the younger generation's time is more valuable to elders. 200 years ago, parents didn't need their kids' help to upgrade to high-definition TV or install the latest version of Windows. Once we get past our hindsight bias, the downsizing of the family is deeply puzzling. In terms of objective conditions, there's never been a better time to have a lot of kids. If you asked parents in the 50s to imagine raising their 4 children with the help of the technology and wealth that we take for granted, they probably would have cheered. Why are so few couples taking advantage of this historic opportunity? Values, self-imposed rules, and foresight. I fear the disapproval of Gary Becker. I want my idol to like me. Still, given his legendary candor, I have to think that he prefers heresy to insincerity. My confession: although I'm familiar with standard enlightened self-interest stories about the incredible shrinking family, 3 non-standard factors strike me as more important: changes in values, changes in self-imposed rules, and changes in foresight. Changes in values. If you look at the general social survey, the decline of marriage and religion explains much of the last 4 decades' fall in family size. The simplest interpretation is that values changed. Marriage, religion, and bringing souls into the world are intertwined, and average Americans take none as seriously as they used to. A connection between changing values and smaller families isn't a reason, selfish or otherwise, to have more kids. This book tries to show you better ways to get what you care about, not tell you what to care about. I acknowledge changing values to avoid overstating my case. Intellectual error explains much of the decline in family size, but not the whole story. Changes in self-imposed rules. Thanks to the growth of technology and wealth, parenting has never been less laborious or more affordable. If objective conditions were decisive, the modern family would be bigger than ever. Still, we can partly salvage the self-interest story of declining family size by casting a wider net. Instead of stubbornly searching for countervailing objective conditions, let's redirect our attention to subjective conditions, the burdens we impose on ourselves. With modern resources, almost anyone can be a good parent by the standards of 1950. But we don't want to be good by the standards of the 50s. We want to be good by the standards of today. During the last half-century, we picked up a list of self-imposed rules, of stuff we gotta do. These rules are awfully strict. As we've seen, the time that parents spend on childcare is way up, even though more moms have jobs and families are smaller. Imagine combining the standards of today with the family size of yesterday. I could almost sell this to Gary Becker, but there's one sticking point. My story is self-interested, but not enlightened. Given all the rules, small families are the prudent choice for today's typical parents. But that's not saying much. The rules are a choice, and child neglect is not the only alternative. What do parents, or kids, get out of these rules? According to twin and adoption studies, not much. Changes in foresight. When I was a child, people often accused others of breeding like rabbits. The picture's not pretty. Rabbits get pregnant 4 times a year, have litters of half a dozen, nurse their young for only minutes a day, and boot them out of the nest after a month. The point of the rabbit analogy is that we expect more from human beings. We ought to use our heads to calculate how many children we can comfortably support and take care not to exceed that number. If you don't use your head, you will not only be a bad parent and a burden on society, you will ruin your life. You don't hear the rabbit analogy much anymore. At least in developed countries, people have too much foresight to breed like rabbits. Many babies remain the fruit of impulsive, unprotected sex, but few parents stick to the rabbit strategy once they have 1 or 2 unplanned children. Look at 30-something American moms who never married. 45% have just 1 child, and 26% have 2. Married moms in their 30s, in contrast, are much more likely to have 2 kids, 41%, rather than 1, 22%. This brings us to my last un-Beckerian explanation for smaller families: changes in foresight. While impulsive, unprotected sex feels as good as ever, we are more likely to look ahead a few years and count the costs. Do you want to spend your 20s having fun and advancing your career, or changing diapers for crying kids? Do you want to spend your 30s with a kid or 2, plus time for other pursuits, or so many kids that you don't have a minute to yourself? In the past, we took the path of least resistance, ignoring future costs in favor of immediate sexual pleasure. As civilization has progressed, more of us have found the foresight to resist or diffuse our biological urges. A little foresight is a dangerous thing. If you're reading this, you're probably a person who plans ahead. Instead of acting on impulse, you're reading a book about how many kids to have. Natalists often argue that foresighted folks like you are the reason so many cradles are empty. Why do you have to overthink everything? If everyone were like you, we would have gone extinct ages ago. Their story, crudely put, is that the human race can only continue with the help of bad judgment and strong liquor. Their story is not mine. Moderate increases in foresight are an important cause of lower fertility. But moderate foresight and high foresight lead to very different family plans. If human beings had 0 foresight, we would have lots of unprotected sex and plenty of kids. If we foresaw only the initial downside of kids, nothing but sleepless nights, temper tantrums, and dirty diapers, we'd be childless, if not celibate. Unfortunately, this is what usually passes for foresight today, weighing short-run pleasure against a few years' worth of negative consequences. True foresight, however, is about calmly optimizing a lifetime's worth of good and bad. The early years are often rough. Many moms agree with Angelina Jolie that pregnancy makes you feel round and supple, and to have a little life inside you is amazing. But others find pregnancy a mixed blessing, or necessary evil. After the delivery, both parents endure trying months. An infant is a lot of work even if you're easy on yourself. I just gave my baby a 2 a.m. stroll to calm him down, and my bedtime is hours away. If you have more than 1 child, your troubles multiply. Caring for 2 youngsters often feels more than twice as stressful. As a veteran of the twins' night shift, I speak from experience. When one baby wakes up while you're feeding another, you're in a no-win situation. One cries if you interrupt the feeding, the other cries if you don't. Moderate foresight tells you to stop having kids. If one infant makes you tired and cranky, why have another? High foresight has a simple response. Infancy is a passing phase, but children last a lifetime, Costs fall. The older kids get, the easier they are to care for. Last week, we left our 7-year-olds home alone for the first time. Before long, they'll be babysitting their little brother. Benefits increase over time, too. Kids who walk and talk are more fun than newborns who sleep and cry. Now gaze further into the future. Once your kids are teenagers, you'll rarely feel like you need a moment to yourself. You'll have to pressure them to spend time with you. When they're grown, all your children will likely be a plus. You'll enjoy their company and take pride in their accomplishments, but no longer bear the responsibility. As an added bonus, every child is another chance for grandchildren. In the winter, strangers are often shocked to see me wearing shorts. "Aren't you cold?" they shout. If I'm outside and it's 40 degrees, I'm freezing, but I don't base my whole decision on the outside temperature. My office runs warm. During January, I'm only outside 5 minutes a day. When I decide what to wear, I maximize my average comfort. I'd rather be 30 degrees too cold for 5 minutes than 10 degrees too hot for 8 hours, so I stick with shorts. Choosing the best number of kids is a lot like deciding what to wear on a winter day. You make one decision, then live with the consequences. The child-free often see this as an argument against kids, but it cuts both ways. People who want kids they can't have are just as trapped as people who have kids they don't want. In fact, irreversibility cuts in favor of kids. As we've seen, regret is abnormal for people who have kids, and normal for people who missed their chance. I admit that a perfectly foresighted person could choose a life of childlessness. If your sole dream is to wander the earth, kids will only slow you down, and perfect foresight almost certainly leads to fewer kids than zero foresight. The thought of 8 kids scares me too. The claim I stand by, typical parental feelings paired with high foresight imply more kids than typical parental feelings paired with moderate foresight. Since the effect of kids on parental well-being changes over time, what precisely does enlightened self-interest advise? For starters, heavily discount the way you feel now. Your feelings are important, but from a purely selfish point of view, your feelings today are no more important than your feelings half a century from now. Instead of dwelling on the present, judiciously estimate the lifetime consequences of plans A through Z, then pick the plan with the highest overall score. One good rule of thumb is to figure out the optimal number of kids to have during each of the major stages of your life. Then set your target number of children equal to your average answer. Suppose you're 30. Selfishly speaking, you conclude that the most pleasant number of children to have during your 30s is 1. During your 40s, your optimal number of kids will rise to 2. You'll have more free time as your kids assert their independence. By the time you're in your 50s, all your kids will be busy with their own lives. At this stage, wouldn't it be nice to have 4 kids who periodically drop by? Finally, once you pass 60 and prepare to retire, you'll have ample free time to spend with your grandchildren. 5 kids would be a good insurance policy against grandchildlessness. If you apply my take the average rule of thumb to this example, the best number of kids is 3. 5 kids would be foolish. You'd sacrifice the rest of your life for a great retirement. It would be similarly foolish to have 1 child in your 30s, declare your life perfect, and schedule a vasectomy. Foresight implores you to strike a balance between too many kids in your early years and too few later on. A time-worn tactic to discourage teen pregnancy is to give students a fake baby, a doll, an egg, whatever, and make them take care of it for a week. The more temperamental the faux infant, the better. Advanced models cry and scream unless their guardians meet expectations. The point is to give a little extra foresight to those who need it most, to show teens what they can expect next year if they have unprotected sex today. If you take this educational exercise literally, however, its lesson is that babies are more trouble than they're worth. The experiment isn't an argument against teens having kids, it's an argument against kids, period. And it's a deeply misleading argument because infancy doesn't last long. Maybe the only way to reach teens is with a noble lie, but I prefer an honest approach. Like, having a child is a serious decision, but if you take the decision seriously enough, you won't just avoid pregnancy until you're ready for kids. You'll also start having kids before it's too late to have as many as you want, or plan ahead before you have a child. But don't just plan on dirty diapers and lost sleep. Remember to look forward to your kids' hilarious questions, trips to Disneyland, and Christmas with your grandchildren. You've probably heard the maxim, "A little knowledge is a dangerous thing." When it comes to kids, a little foresight is a dangerous thing too. Looking a few years ahead, it's tempting to conclude that the best number of children is one or none. But from a bird's eye view of your whole life, a 0 to 1 child policy usually looks like a big mistake. Foresight and fertility, friends not foes. Natalist attacks on the excessive foresight of civilized man bother me in two ways. First, I take them personally. I happen to be a person of foresight. I started pondering retirement long before I got my first real job. My current plan is to work till I drop. Second, and more important, the critique of foresight buys into the view that kids are a bad deal. Exhausted parents of young children who vow never again normally have selfish motives. But are they good at being selfish? Maybe in the midst of their temporary misery, they calmly computed the lifetime consequences of another child and found that it's not worth it. If they really have such stoic detachment, great, but real human beings are more likely to be myopic, to let the negatives right before their eyes unduly tilt their decision. When your toddler is driving you crazy, you have to struggle to remember that he'll only be 2 once. How myopic are parents? Judging by their body language, they focus almost wholly on the here and now. When they imagine the short-term consequences of another kid, they often visibly recoil. But if you mention the consequences 20 or 30 years hence, they apathetically roll their eyes. Maybe they've thought through their middle age and retirement so carefully that the topic bores them. Maybe they're keeping their deliberations secret to spite me. More plausibly, however, they're too short-sighted to put, "How many kids will I want when I'm 60?" on their list of things to wonder about. If I had telepathy, I could check my suspicions. Since I don't, I'll never conclusively prove that parents are myopic to my own satisfaction, much less anyone else's. From a social scientist's point of view, this is a frustrating limitation. From your point of view, however, it's not relevant, because you can measure your myopia by looking inside yourself. You know whether you've gazed all the way to the horizon. You know whether you've calmly weighed the lifetime consequences of another child. If you've been there and done that, wonderful. If you haven't, I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I'm appealing to your prudence. You were good at being self-interested. How many kids will I want when I'm 60? Would interest you as much as, how many kids do I want right now? If your answers to these two questions are not the same, balancing your present and future interests is no sacrifice. It's common sense. Splitting the difference is as selfish as waking up a little early to pack yourself a lunch.